And here are the results. Wow, it's twice as fast. M2 MacBook Air versus 14-inch MacBook Pro. So many of you guys asked us to do this comparison, so here we go. We have spec'd these to our recommended configurations, and the crazy thing is that there is only a difference of 150 bucks if you pick up the refurbished model on Amazon, which you can return for 90 days. And you can get the 14-inch right now instead of waiting close to a month. So in this video, not only are we gonna compare the design, the size and weight, the displays, speakers, we're also gonna do real world productivity tasks to see how much faster is the 14-inch really, and is it worth the extra cash, either 150 bucks in this case, or maybe 200 or 250 if you buy this where it's constantly on sale. And on top of that, we are gonna do a battery life comparison. Both of these are at 100%, and a lot of people say the 14-inch doesn't have great battery life, so we will see how it compares in real world as we're shooting this video and running these tests. Now, a lot of people wanna buy the Air because of its portability, and when you look at them online, they might not seem like they're that different, but holding them in the hand, you could see that the 14-inch is a little bit taller, it's slightly wider as well, and the craziest part is the difference in thickness and how light the Air is. It is dramatic in the real world. Now, for that extra weight and size, you get more ports. On the left side, we have Thunderbolt 4 ports on the 14-inch, which means you can hook up additional displays instead of one, and we have our headphone jack. And on the right side, you get a full-size HDMI 2.0 port, another Thunderbolt 4 port, and an SD card reader, which is very convenient for creators. And of course, the 14-inch has dual fans built in, whereas the M2 Air is completely fanless. Now you can really see the thickness difference when you have them next to each other. Look how much thicker the whole main portion of the 14-inch is. And when I'm resting my wrists on here, you feel this edge a lot more so than the ultra thin M2 MacBook Air. As far as the keyboards, they are very similar, but the MacBook Air actually feels better to me because it has a little bit more feedback. And as far as the trackpads, both are excellent. The 14 inches slightly larger, but doesn't make a difference in the real world. What will make a difference is the speakers. The M2 Air has no more speaker grill holes. It's hidden inside and fires up against the screen. It does have 2 additional speakers that are for the low end this year, compared to a 6 speaker system on the 14-inch. And I'm very excited to hear the difference. Let's go ahead and take a listen. And there is no contest at all. The 14-inch is louder, has way deeper bass. It just sounds better in every single way. We were hoping the M2 Air would sound better than it does, but with it being so thin, I guess this is the best they could do. So if you care about speakers, definitely the 14-inch. This is the webcam and microphone quality from the M2 MacBook Air, which was just updated to a 1080p camera sensor. And this is the 14-inch MacBook Pro. I'm really curious, how does this 1080p camera stack up to the M2 MacBook Airs, and what about the microphones? You guys go ahead and let me know down in the comments section below. As far as displays, it's interesting that Apple labels both 14 inches, but the Pro is actually larger, as you guys could see, and it has a higher resolution, 254 ppi compared to 227. But when it comes down to normal use, you can't really tell a difference. And the same thing goes for brightness and for contrast under regular lighting. Where the difference really comes in is for HDR. When we're watching this video, the contrast looks better on the 14 inches mini LED display, which has a ton of little zones and LEDs, and the brightness really pops. With that, the colors pop as well. It's just a much better viewing experience. And on top of that, if you're somebody that wants to edit HDR videos or photos, you definitely need the 14-inch. Now, yes, you can get blooming under certain situations with the mini LED on the 14-inch, but for the most part, it's a non-issue, and it's better than having a fully gray screen as far as the bars and the blacks like you get with LCD displays, which is what's in the M2 MacBook Air. Now the other difference is ProMotion. The 14-inch has 120 Hz refresh rate, which makes everything super smooth, just like on the new Pro iPhones compared to being stuck at 60 Hz. And that can also save you battery life because it can drop down to low refresh rates when you're not going to notice it. And now let's get into performance and see how much of a difference is there really. Both of these are 8-core models. The 14-inch is binned, but the difference is the Air has 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency compared to 6 performance cores and 2 efficiency on the 14-inch. The M1 Pro processor also runs at a lower frequency than the new M2. And now let's go ahead and do a quick run of Geekbench 5 to see what differences we get. Remember, both of these are equipped with 16 gigs of RAM. We're almost done with this test, and one interesting thing is that the fans are still off on the 14-inch. A lot of times for lower loads or even higher ones that are a little bit more bursty, this is still technically a machine that's almost fanless because they're off. All right, we have our results, and the M2 beats out the 14-inch by 9% in single core. It has the fastest single core of any laptop, but in multi-core, the 14-inch beats out by 11%. So there is very little difference in terms of this general benchmark that runs a lot of different tasks. But we'll see what the difference is in real-world productivity. As far as web browsing, the M2 Air does load up websites and JavaScript and different things quite a bit quicker, over 40% compared to the 14-inch. So if you're looking for a web browsing machine mainly, the Air is definitely gonna be great. As far as the SSDs, we have the 512 model of the Air. So it has 2 NAND chips. So as you guys can see, it's working really quick. But with that, the 14-inch still smokes it because it's using PCI Express 4 SSDs. So we have a 60% faster write speed and an 85% faster read speed. So you're getting much better SSDs with the 14-inch. Now, before we jump into the harder tests, I wanna give you guys an update on the battery life. Our 14-inch is at 90%. We've been running tests, transferring files, maxing out the screen, and the Air is also at 90%. They are identical for these kind of lighter, easier tasks. But now let's jump into the tough tests and see how they do. As far as music production with Logic, we're testing out the new Logic benchmark. You can read about it online. And you would think there wouldn't be that big of a difference based on Geekbench, but for this task, the 14-inch is a lot more stable. We're getting about 135 tracks before it overloads compared to about 77. So for music production, you definitely want to go for a 14-inch if you're going to be using a lot of effects, plugins, and different tracks. And now let's see what kind of difference we have when it comes to coding with Xcode. We're compiling our code, and shortly after we started, the Mac heated up. Right now it's at 108 degrees Celsius. It bounced down a bit and back up there, so it may be modulating its power. Whereas with the 14-inch, we're at 81 Celsius right now. Fans are off, 86 Celsius, is staying right around there. So it's still a fanless machine, even compiling this code. And that took 1 minute and 19 seconds for the M2 Air and 1 minute and 11 seconds for the 14-inch MacBook Pro. So for shorter compiles like this, there is very little difference, and you get a cheaper system that is lighter and more portable. So some programs might want to go for this, but if you're going to be doing compiles that are going to be half-hour long or longer, then you'll probably notice a much bigger difference because of throttling. So we tested 2 of those apps that are CPU based, but now let's really max out the CPUs and compare thermals and throttling. I'm going to start out by using my thermal cam to take a look and get a baseline. It looks like the hottest point of the M2 Air is the display at 31, 32 degrees. Most of it's very cool, whereas our 14-inch, you guys can see there are some cooler portions, but in general, it is warmer based on the color. And now let's start our 10-minute throttling test in Cinebench. We're gonna look at the performance of the systems, how much throttling we get, and with that, the frequencies. So starting out, the M2 Air is running at 3.2 gigahertz compared to 3 gigahertz on the 14-inch, and that is just because of the updated chip with higher frequencies. Interestingly, power usage is very similar, both 21.6, 21.6 over there, pretty much identical amounts of power, but the 14-inch has more performance cores. The M2 Air is actually averaging slightly more power than the 14-inch. That is crazy. And with that, we're already at 108 degrees Celsius on the Air, whereas here we're at 81 degrees for the highest core, 83 now, and the fans are still off. And that is because the M2 Air doesn't even have a proper heatsink. There's an empty space where one could go, whereas the 14-inch, those heat pipes are sucking the heat away from the CPU and into the fin section, so it has all that thermal headroom. And right now the fans just kicked on the 14-inch. It literally took over 2 minutes of 100% CPU load in order to get it hot enough to do that. And it was at about 90 degrees. We're at 92 now. So Apple is not letting the system get as hot as it does with the M2 Air. And after 3 minutes, the M2 Air is now using about 15 watts compared to over 21 before. So now it's slowing down. We're running at 2.8 gigahertz, almost 2.9, whereas the 14-inch is running steady and actually using more power now than it did before once the fans kicked up. It's been 5 minutes and the 14-inch is super consistent. And as far as the fans, even right there, I can't even hear them. It is basically a silent machine. And it's interesting how even the efficiency cores in the M2 Air are over 100 degrees compared to here where they're in their 80s and the performance cores are in the 90s. And that's probably because the M2 has much more powerful efficiency cores. They're about 23% faster and they're being put to use. We're almost done now. Let's take another thermal reading. Our M2 is running at 48 degrees Celsius, a lot of heat there, and it doesn't spread that much to the sides, whereas the 14-inch, we're at 44, 45, and you actually see the exhaust right there blowing hot air up on the screen, and then the sides and bottom stay cooler. And as far as the power, we started at over 21 watts, and now we're down to 13.5 on the M2, so it has throttled quite a lot. And I'm really surprised that the 14-inch, it stays right around 3,000 RPMs, which aren't even halfway. The temp stays stable and the power usage is actually higher than at the start. And so it's silent and very consistent, even at the 100% load. So after all that throttling, what are the results? Well, our 14-inch got 9,411 points and the M2 Air got 8,003 points. That is a difference of 17%. Much less than I expected after seeing how much that wattage dropped. Previously, I think it was like 11% difference for short bursty tasks. So this is definitely not bad. Now, of course, if it was longer than 10 minutes, it would slow down even more, but I'm still pretty impressed. Now, if you guys haven't seen our video on the low power mode for the M2 Air, testing out those efficiency cores, you guys have to check it out after this video. You'll be really impressed. So we tested out the CPU only tasks. Now let's switch to graphics. The M2 Air has an 8-core binned GPU. That's our preference. We did an 8 versus 10 comparison. And here we have the 14-core binned out of 16. We have our results and it's a pretty big difference. The 14-inch is scoring higher than when we tested it before. And at this point, we have 47% more score, even though we have about 75% more cores for this 14 core compared to 8. But we'll see what kind of a difference we get with real world applications. And now let's push the graphics a little bit harder and for longer with 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme Stress Test. This is going to push it for 20 minutes. It's gonna give us scores, how consistent it is, and what kind of throttling we see if you are doing a longer load. Now, right out of the gate, our 14-inch is using almost 20 watts of graphics power compared to about 10 watts for the M2 Air. That's twice as much power usage. I'm gonna be interested in the battery life here in a little bit. We are gonna let this run and get back to you guys after almost 20 minutes. We are almost done here, and what's very interesting is that they're both running at very similar temperatures now. The M2 Air throttled from about 10 watts down to about 6.8 and staying consistent. Whereas the 14-inch, it is running at full power, but it did spin up its fans to about 4,000 RPMs, just over half here. So they're both running the same temperatures, just we're getting a big difference in performance. And here are the results. This is interesting. We have a stability of 99.5 on the 14-inch. That is incredible, consistent performance compared to 80% on the M2 Air, meaning it throttled down and lost performance as far as frame rates. Now you guys see right over here at the start, it did pretty consistently, about 5 minutes. It just dived down and throttled a lot. And if we scroll over and look at the last loop, loop 20 was actually the lowest score, meaning if you were playing longer or we were testing longer, it probably could go down even lower. And realistically, if you're playing games, who's gonna be gaming for just only 20 minutes? Now, if you're loading up the GPU very heavily for other tasks that aren't gaming, you're gonna see a similar result. So at the start, the 14-inch was over 60% faster, higher frame rate compared to M2 Air. But after the 20-minute run, it literally was 100% faster, twice the frame rate. So that is a massive difference for only a little bit more money. And now for those of you guys that want to do some 3D modeling and rendering, I have Blender opened up, the one that can use the graphics to do rendering with cycles. So let's go ahead and test out this classic classroom scene. All right, we are finished. Our 14-inch took 3 minutes and 38 seconds, whereas the M2 took 5 minutes and 2 seconds. Nowhere near as big of a difference as we saw in 3D Mark, and that is because this uses a lot less wattage, less power to do this. It doesn't heat up as much, doesn't throttle. So that difference was 28%. The M2 is 28% slower, whereas before it was looking like it was 60% slower, 100% slower. So in Blender, not a massive difference. And now let's get into some photo editing. I have Photoshop opened up right here with 9 different images. We're gonna do an HDR test, and let's see how long it takes with a mix of CPU and graphics usage. Wow, that was extremely close. It took 20 seconds for the 14-inch and 22 seconds for the M2. Now the M2 with 16 gigs of RAM is very fast at photo editing, so that might not even be worth upgrading to 14-inch for you guys. But now let's go ahead and open up Lightroom Classic, and we might see a bigger difference there. As far as regular editing, there is really no difference. They're both extremely snappy. So if you're doing adjustments, brushes, it's hard to tell a difference. Now we're gonna go ahead and export these 50 edited raw images. It's not a lot of people do way more than that, but let's see what kind of a difference we get. Once again, both of these systems are very fast. The M2 MacBook Air took 1 minute and 16 seconds, whereas the 14-inch took 56 seconds. So the M2 is about 26% slower. But if you're not doing a ton of images, you're not doing 1,000, 1,500 for weddings, the M2 can do a great job as long as you don't need HDR. And now for you video editors out there, we have Final Cut open, and we have our standard 4K test. We have some color corrections applied, some LUTs, just your standard amount of effects that regular people would use, and both are playing them back perfectly fine. These chips have great encoding engines and decoding. As far as the GPU usage, we have 65% on the 14-inch and 71% on the M2 Air. That means that it's not that big of a difference of power required, and you don't have that much more overhead left over on the 14-inch after running this. So that's kind of surprising to me. Now let's go ahead and export both of these 5-minute projects. All right guys, this is interesting. We're at 85% on the M2 and 76, 77 on the 14-inch M1 Pro. So the encoders are updated and they are faster for this M2 processor on the Air. That took 2 minutes and 19 seconds for the M2 Air and 2 minutes and 36 seconds for the 14-inch. Now, obviously it's not a huge difference. It'll be slightly bigger if you're rendering longer projects, but the M2 does encode faster for your standard compressed footage. But now let's take a look at something a little bit more difficult. This is gonna be ProRes RAW 4K. Both these are playing back perfectly fine, and it's interesting that the 14-inch actually requires more CPU and GPU power. We're at 22% CPU, 71 GPU, compared to the M2 Air, which is at about 13% CPU and about 72 now, 71. It's changing a little bit for the graphics. It's a weaker system, but it requires less of that, probably because Apple did add ProRes encoders and decoders to the system, and it might be a newer version than the one in the 14-inch. So now let's go ahead and export this 5-minute project to ProRes with different color gradings applied. And wow, look at that. The 14-inch is flying right now. We're looking at 31% compared to 19. And that is because our limitation here is the graphics. The faster the graphics can go, the faster the ProRes encoders can encode. And in this case, both of the graphics are being maxed out. The CPU we're using more of on the 14-inch because it can keep up with the graphics. And this export is going quite a bit faster. We have 1 minute and 51 seconds for the M2 Air and 1 minute and 7 seconds for the 14-inch. It's not twice as fast, but it's close to that. So once you start getting into some tougher things that will use the CPU and the GPU, and they're not limited, we see a bigger difference. And now let's do something that is much harder. This is some 4.5K red raw footage that maxes out the GPU. It also uses CPU. And as we take a look, neither of these can play it back perfectly at full resolution. They're both skipping frames. It's a lot of graphics power that's required. But of course, in Final Cut, we can go and switch over to the better performance mode. And then that's gonna give us, it's gonna optimize for playback. And now, it looks like both of them are playing it back perfectly smoothly. And it's interesting that the 14-inch is actually using more graphics power to play it back than the M2 Air. Very, very interesting. Now I do have some film grain applied and some color corrections, and if you're editing on such a small screen, you can use that better playback mode and it's gonna work well. But if you connect to an external display, well, that's where it look way too bad if you're gonna judge focus and things like that. And what about Canon RAW? I have a project from the C200 here. Playing it back in normal mode, you guys see the 14-inch is much smoother. It's probably not perfect, but it's editable, where this, you guys see a ton of choppiness here. This is not workable unless you go into the better playback mode. And now I'm gonna export this 1 minute short project that's gonna hammer the CPU and the graphics. Right away, we hit 108 degrees Celsius on the 14-inch here. We're at 92, the fan's kicked up. All right, our M2 Air took 2 minutes and 8 seconds compared to 1 minute and 24 seconds for the 14-inch. So it's not twice as fast, but it's getting close to that. So you guys see when stuff gets harder, the difference becomes greater. And I actually did the 8K Canon RAW test, which people said was overkill, but wanted to test out throttling. And it took 11 minutes and 21 seconds for the 14-inch and 21 minutes and 59 seconds for the M2 Air. So literally it's twice as slow, or it takes twice as long once you start doing something that's much harder. So there you guys go. We did the video editing, and now let's take a look at battery life. With the 14-inch, we have 6% remaining. We started with 100%. We shoot these for hours and hours, and we're hitting them with these different tests. But the M2 MacBook Air, it looks like it has more. It has 22% remaining, giving us roughly 20% better battery life, somewhere like that. Now, some of these tests, they both ran at the same time, and it also throttled, used less power, but some of them, the 14-inch was able to do much quicker, and then it just sat there and waited while the M2 Air was still working. So overall, you could definitely expect better battery life with the M2 Air. And then of course you can hook it up to a power bank, and you don't need as much power to be able to charge it because it uses less power. So there you guys go. Which one of these is worth it? If you do care about productivity and performance and you are gonna upgrade your SSD and your RAM, is it worth spending more to get the 14-inch? It's not that much more, sometimes only 150 bucks or 200 bucks brand new on sale. Well, personally, I say if you care about things like photo editing, video editing, maybe not coding, we didn't see much of a difference there. Blender especially, and especially gaming, the 14-inch definitely comes out ahead, especially if you're gonna do extended tests. Whereas if you do some of those tasks, but you're a hobbyist level and you care about having a system that's small and lightweight, great battery, I think the M2 MacBook Air is still very capable. You guys saw all those tests, especially if you care about having a portable package and you wanna save a little bit of money. It will still do a surprisingly good job in some of these tasks. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Please hit that subscribe button if you guys enjoy these videos. Check out one of those right over there. This has been Max with Max Tech, and I'll see you in the next video.